Traoré stopped 50 trucks at the border. What were they carrying? We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream too. At exactly 2:43 a.m., under the flickering border lights of Burkina Faso's northern checkpoint, a convoy of 50 unmarked trucks rolled in slowly, their engines humming like a distant thunder. The guards on duty weren't expecting traffic, especially not this many vehicles in the dead of night. When questioned, the lead driver handed over a stack of transit documents that looked legitimate at first glance, but something felt off. None of the drivers spoke the local dialect fluently. Their routes were vague. And the declared cargo? Construction materials. No brand names. No shipping labels. Just silence. Colonel Mega, commander of the border unit, didn't hesitate. He placed a direct call to the presidential line. President Ibrahim Traoré, though roused from sleep, didn't need convincing. In the past months, he'd received quiet intelligence reports, whispers of systematic extractions moving through land routes. Gold, uranium, rare earths. Always labeled infrastructure supplies. Always under foreign license. He told Mega only one thing: do not let them pass. Hold them. I'm coming. Within hours, Traoré was airborne in a military helicopter, eyes locked on the horizon. He knew this was no coincidence. 50 trucks didn't cross a desert at night without purpose. When Traoré arrived at the checkpoint, the drivers stood in silence beside their idling vehicles. Behind them, local villagers had gathered, murmuring, confused. The president ordered the trucks searched. Slowly, methodically, one by one. The first truck was filled with sealed crates. The second the same. On the third, an officer pried open a box. Inside, glimmering gold bars, stacked tightly, unmarked. The crowd gasped. Traoré's jaw clenched. The fourth truck? Rare minerals, wrapped in export-grade foil. By the seventh truck it was clear, none of this was for infrastructure. This was a silent heist. A bleeding artery. But the most shocking moment came not from what they found, but from what one of the drivers finally confessed in a hushed voice. This shipment was scheduled weekly. Always nights. Always under protection. When Traoré asked, who protects it? The man trembled before answering, foreign diplomats. Some from within. The words hung in the desert air like smoke. A slow fury burned in Traoré's eyes. He turned toward his officers and villagers alike and spoke with unshakable resolve. Tonight, history does not repeat, it breaks. The crowd erupted. What began as routine inspection was now the start of something irreversible. By dawn, word of the seizure had spread beyond the border village, carried by radio signals, WhatsApp messages, and hurried phone calls. In Ouagadougou, news anchors scrambled to confirm the impossible. That President Traoré had personally intercepted a secret convoy of gold and minerals destined for foreign export. For many, it confirmed a long-held suspicion that the wealth of Africa was still being siphoned out under layers of paperwork, diplomatic immunity, and silence. Yet what stunned the public more than the gold itself were the documents found stashed beneath the driver's seats of Truck 13. These weren't ordinary logs. Handwritten in French and coded shorthand, the ledgers detailed years of movement, not just materials, but names, dates, and diplomatic endorsements. Each shipment was linked to permits signed by foreign agencies operating under development aid agreements. Even worse, the logs included initials matching domestic officials, a betrayal from within. They kept records, Traoré muttered, flipping through the pages. They were arrogant enough to think we'd never look. He handed the documents to his intelligence chief with one order: decrypt everything. We expose them all. Meanwhile, journalists gathered outside the checkpoint, blocked from approaching but relentless in their coverage. Traoré refused to speak to foreign press, opting instead for a live address on Burkina Faso's national television. Wearing his military uniform, he stood beside the open trucks as cameras rolled. They said Africa was poor. But we were being robbed while they shook our hands. His voice didn't rise. It sharpened. 50 trucks. Over 100 billion CFA in stolen resources. And not one Western embassy has explained why. That night, even skeptical citizens turned their eyes toward the presidency with something new: belief. International reactions were swift and telling. A major European ambassador quietly left Burkina Faso the next morning. The World Bank issued a vague statement urging calm and cooperation. But inside Traoré's war room, calm was the last word on anyone's mind. Maps were rolled out. Border routes were analyzed. Suspicious past shipments were flagged. And most notably, 3 names reappeared across multiple ledgers, all high-ranking officials, still seated in government roles. Traoré said nothing for several minutes. Then he leaned forward and pointed at their photos. "They go next," he said. "No matter how high. No matter who protects them." The first name was familiar to Traoré, a former economic advisor who had once warned him against nationalizing gold assets, calling it a reckless move that would scare investors. The second was more discreet, a customs liaison embedded at the Ministry of Finance, who had spent the last 8 years overseeing foreign cargo movements. But it was the third that caused the room to fall into silence. Colonel Pascal Ndoye, decorated military officer, former friend of Traoré, and once considered a candidate for defense minister. His initials were on 6 shipments. 6. "I broke bread with this man," Traoré muttered. "And he sold our future." The arrests were swift, silent, and televised. Traoré didn't believe in private justice anymore, not after what he'd seen buried in those ledgers. The men were taken from their homes at 3 a.m., escorted by military police and streamed on national television. In his address that morning, Traoré said only one sentence: "If you betray your people, the people will know your name." Streets erupted in cheers. For years, citizens had whispered of corruption but had never seen real consequences. Now they watched not just punishment, but proof. The betrayal was real, but so was justice. Across Africa, other leaders watched with unease. Traoré had drawn a line in the sand not just against foreign powers, but against collaborators within. And his people stood behind him. Demonstrations erupted in support. In Bamako, Niamey, Kinshasa, people held up mock gold bars with signs that read, "Our gold, our right." The symbolism was unmistakable. What had begun as a border seizure had become a regional awakening. For the first time in decades, a head of state wasn't begging for aid, he was demanding accountability. And the continent was listening. In Europe and Washington, the tone shifted. News outlets now called the trucks a logistical misunderstanding, while diplomats pushed for behind-closed-doors resolution. But Traoré refused. "They plundered us publicly," he said. "So we respond publicly." He opened the ledgers to international observers. He invited independent journalists to review the evidence. And he called for an emergency session of the African Union to present his findings. But privately, his advisors worried. "This path you've chosen," one said, "will make powerful enemies." Traoré simply replied, "I didn't choose this path. They did, when they thought no one was watching." 3 weeks after the trucks were seized, leaders from across the continent gathered in Addis Ababa for an emergency African Union summit. The mood was tense. Some arrived out of genuine solidarity. Others came reluctantly, pressured by their own citizens now demanding answers. The room was filled with flags, security, and silence. No one wanted to be the first to speak. But when President Ibrahim Traoré took the floor, holding a worn copy of the seized ledgers, all eyes turned. He didn't speak like a man giving a speech. He spoke like a soldier reading a battlefield report. "These are not documents," he said, holding them high. "They are receipts for what was stolen." He laid them out on the table, photocopies showing the flow of gold, lithium, cobalt, and diamonds. Names, countries, dates. We do not lack resources. We lack the courage to say no. Some in the room nodded slowly. Others avoided his gaze. But he continued. This is not Burkina Faso's problem. It is Africa's problem. What passes through my borders passed through yours yesterday, and it will pass through another's tomorrow. The silence cracked. A low murmur rose. Then the president of Mali stood up and said, "Let him continue." Traoré proposed something radical, a continental task force to audit all resource exports, independent of Western influence. A new African regulatory body with rotating leadership. Transparency across all contracts signed in the past 25 years. Some called it impossible. But then came the moment that changed everything. He played a voice recording from one of the truck drivers. The man, trembling, confessed how Western security consultants trained them to cross checkpoints. How local officials were bribed monthly. The truth was raw and undeniable. A stunned hush swept the room. Then applause. Cautious at first, but growing. Unity had cracked through fear. Outside the summit, protesters cheered as news broke. For decades, the African Union had been criticized as symbolic, powerless, compromised. But that day, something shifted. A resolution passed unanimously. A 3-month moratorium on rare mineral exports, pending review. It was temporary, but it was historic. Inside Burkina Faso, people wept. The gold that once left in silence had now given rise to a voice too loud to ignore. As Traoré left the summit hall, a journalist asked, "Do you fear retaliation from the West?" He stopped, turned to the cameras, and said, "Let them fear the silence of the continent no longer." Barely a week after the African Union passed its moratorium, the retaliation began. Foreign media outlets suddenly erupted with reports of political instability in Burkina Faso. Anonymous sources claimed economic collapse was imminent. Investment firms downgraded the country's credit rating overnight. Aid packages were quietly suspended. Sanctions, subtle but targeted, started appearing in sectors that had nothing to do with gold or minerals. Medicine imports, academic grants, food logistics. It was a message written in red tape and sealed with economic pressure. Stand down. But Traoré didn't flinch. "If truth costs us comfort," he said, "we pay." Inside his cabinet, however, tensions rose. Ministers who once stood beside him now questioned his pace. "We need allies," whispered one. "We need quiet," muttered another. But Traoré had made a decision. He gathered them in the war room, placed the original ledgers on the table, and said, "This is our proof. This is our weapon. And this," he pointed to the people cheering outside the palace gates, "is our shield." Then he announced a new initiative, the Continental Gold Registry, a public, digital ledger tracking every gram of gold mined, moved, and monetized within Africa. "Let them hide nothing from us anymore." The West responded predictably. Embassies issued travel warnings. Mining companies filed lawsuits. One European ambassador even released a thinly veiled threat about diplomatic consequences for undermining trade agreements. But for every action, the African public grew louder. Hashtags surged. Hashtag Our Gold Our Voice. Hashtag Africa Rises. Hashtag TraorTruth. In Kenya, youth marched in solidarity. In Nigeria, musicians released protest anthems. And in Ghana, elderly chiefs broke tradition by publicly supporting the movement. The attempt to isolate Traoré had backfired. Instead of dividing the continent, it had sparked a collective memory of what was lost and what could be reclaimed. Then came the most unexpected development. Whistleblowers. 2 former logistics contractors from a European mining firm stepped forward with video evidence of bribery, maps of smuggling routes, and audio recordings naming diplomats and CEOs. Traoré immediately invited them to testify before the Pan-African Court, which he now called upon to reopen colonial-era trade treaties. "They said we were uneducated," he told the press. But the educated never asked who profits when our minds go silent. The people roared. The retaliation had only fueled the revolution. And Traoré, once doubted even by his own allies, now stood not alone, but with a continent rising behind him. It began with a list. 53 names, handwritten in blue ink, scanned, and uploaded to Burkina Faso's official government website. The headline read, "Entities and individuals banned from operating on African soil pending investigation." The list included CEOs of multinational mining conglomerates, senior diplomats, economists, and even African nationals who had acted as middlemen in extraction contracts. Traoré's government dubbed them economic saboteurs. The message was clear: you can no longer exploit this continent and expect to dine at its table. Within hours, the page received over 8 million views. International institutions were livid. Spokespersons condemned the move as reckless populism. But for the first time in decades, African leaders from multiple nations didn't rush to apologize or distance themselves. Instead, some quietly consulted their own ministries, reviewing foreign contracts and requesting copies of the ledgers Traoré had shared in Addis Ababa. The blacklist wasn't just punitive, it was catalytic. Across the continent, young technocrats and civil society groups began publishing open-source maps showing mining zones, ownership chains, and export routes. Transparency was becoming weaponized, and those who profited from silence began scrambling. One of the blacklisted firms attempted retaliation by launching a disinformation campaign, paying local media to paint Traoré as a dictator suppressing business. But the people didn't buy it. Not anymore. They had seen the trucks. They had heard the confessions. They knew the names. In response, Traoré launched the People's Tribunal for Resource Theft, a public court streamed online, where whistleblowers could testify safely and African citizens could watch in real time. The first session featured a former border officer who broke down in tears, confessing he'd been paid to look the other way. His voice shook, but the silence in the room was louder. Traoré then made a stunning announcement. All previously signed foreign resource contracts would be suspended and renegotiated with oversight from citizen councils. Western governments protested, calling it a breach of international norms. But Traoré simply replied, "Whose norms? Whose interests?" The new negotiations were televised, translated into local dialects, and held in open-air forums. This wasn't just policy. It was revolution, wrapped not in violence, but in visibility. For the first time, the people were part of the deal. And across Africa, other presidents began to whisper, "If he succeeds, we must follow." 1 month after the blacklist, a train arrived in Ouagadougou under heavy military escort. It wasn't carrying weapons or dignitaries, but 20 crates of unrefined gold ore, freshly mined from a site that had once been operated by a French multinational. Now nationalized, the mine was under the management of local engineers and guarded by former soldiers who had once been unemployed and forgotten. The shipment wasn't symbolic, it was literal. Gold from the land, moved by the people, protected by the state. Traoré stood on the platform as the crates were unloaded, raising one bar in the air. "This," he said, "is how sovereignty feels." He invited school children to see the bars, placed them on display at the National Museum, and released full transparency documents online. Where it came from, who extracted it, and how it would be reinvested. The proceeds, he explained, would fund healthcare infrastructure in rural areas, teacher salaries, and tech education for girls. Gold should not sit in European vaults while our people die from preventable diseases, he declared. The announcement rippled through West Africa like thunder. It wasn't just a promise. It was a plan. And it gave gold a new language, not of greed, but of dignity. Global powers, however, grew nervous. Gold markets fluctuated, analysts warned of African uncertainty, and private intelligence reports labeled Traoré as a destabilizing force. A leaked diplomatic memo from Brussels even described him as a charismatic problem with a contagious vision. But African populations had already caught the fever. In Dakar, a massive mural appeared overnight with Traoré's face overlaid by a golden sunrise. In Kampala, university students staged mock negotiations of colonial-era contracts. In Cape Town, a chorus of activists projected "Africa is not for sale" onto the wall of a foreign embassy. The continent wasn't merely inspired, it was waking up. Then came the surprise move. Traoré proposed an African gold reserve, jointly held by member states of the African Union, independent from the IMF or World Bank. The goal? To create an emergency fund that protected African currencies from manipulation. "Our wealth should shield us, not enslave us," he said. Some presidents were cautious, others enthusiastic, but all understood one thing. This was no longer about one leader or one country. This was about Africa reclaiming control over the pulse of its own economy. And the gold that once whispered from under the soil now roared in the hands of the people. 2 weeks after Traoré announced the formation of the African Gold Reserve, Western banks struck back. In a coordinated move, over $3 billion in African sovereign assets were suddenly frozen across European and American financial institutions. The official justification cited irregularities and security concerns, but the true message was clear: you will not leave the system. Overnight, development projects stalled, imports were delayed, and currency markets wobbled. Foreign press celebrated the move as a necessary intervention. But inside Africa, fury ignited. People who had remained skeptical of Traoré now asked, why would they fear us if we had nothing to take back? Traoré called an emergency cabinet meeting. He wasn't angry, he was calm. "They've shown their hand," he said. "Now we show our plan." He instructed all ministries to accelerate the implementation of the gold reserve and unveiled a temporary internal trade mechanism. Gold-backed promissory notes to be used between member states, avoiding the dollar and euro entirely. "Let their freeze show us the fire we must build," he told the press. His words went viral. In Lagos, people chanted them in the streets. In Johannesburg, graffiti of golden chains breaking appeared on highways. What was meant to crush had only clarified the mission. Meanwhile, whistleblower leaks continued to surface. A former World Bank analyst released internal memos showing the institution's quiet panic about Traoré's influence spreading. "If this movement solidifies, we may face a continent-wide shift away from the Bretton Woods system," one memo read. Another described Traoré as the most unpredictable variable in African economic modeling. It was no longer about Burkina Faso. It was about an idea that Africa could define wealth on its own terms. The West had financial weapons, yes, but Traoré had truth. And truth, once revealed to the masses, doesn't retreat. Then came the most shocking twist. Several African countries that had historically voted with Western interests at the UN now issued a joint statement supporting Burkina Faso's move. "Our people are tired of prosperity that never arrives," it read. "We support all peaceful efforts to reclaim economic justice." It was subtle, diplomatic, but revolutionary in tone. In private, French and American advisors panicked. For decades, they had counted on African division. But now, unity was taking root. And Traoré, once seen as a lone disruptor, now stood as the unwitting architect of a continental awakening, built not on vengeance, but on vision. At sunrise, Traoré made the most daring move of his presidency. In a live broadcast from Ouagadougou, he announced that his government had obtained classified satellite imagery, bank transfer data, and diplomatic correspondences proving that over 42% of African-extracted gold in the past 2 decades had never been declared, nor taxed, by its rightful owners. The footage showed private planes leaving isolated airstrips, smuggling gold to vaults in Geneva, Dubai, and London. "These are not rumors. These are receipts," Traoré said, holding up documents. "And the world will no longer pretend not to see them." The reaction was immediate. Global bullion markets tumbled. News agencies scrambled to verify the evidence. Some attempted to dismiss it as fabricated. But soon, independent journalists, blockchain analysts, and former employees of extraction firms confirmed the leaks. A map circulated showing the coordinates of hidden vaults and shadow ports used exclusively for resource smuggling. International trust began to fracture, not in Traoré's story, but in the economic system that had made such theft possible. The emperor had no clothes, and Traoré had pulled the curtain back for all to see. In Africa, the revelations caused a cascade of responses. Universities launched truth commissions. Traditional leaders called emergency gatherings to recover ancestral land rights. Citizens demanded audits in their own nations. In Accra, over 10,000 people camped outside Parliament, chanting, "Where is our gold?" In Nairobi, a group of teenagers hacked a mining company's website and replaced it with Traoré's speech. Even countries that had previously distanced themselves from the Burkinabe president were forced to respond to the outrage at home. The truth was out, and it was heavier than gold. Traoré ended the broadcast with a simple sentence that reverberated around the globe: "Africa is not poor. Africa has been robbed." It became the quote of the decade. Painted on walls, sung in songs, printed on shirts, and carved into the hearts of those who had been told for generations to expect less. It was no longer just a political movement, it was cultural, a spiritual reawakening. And the man who started it, standing in front of the world's cameras with dusty documents and trembling hands, was no longer just a president. He was a mirror, reflecting back to Africa what had always belonged to it. On the final day of the Pan-African Economic Conference in Addis Ababa, an unprecedented silence filled the Grand Hall. Ibrahim Traoré, invited as a guest speaker, took the stage not with prepared remarks, but with a briefcase. Inside were certified records from Swiss banks, GPS coordinates of secret gold storage sites, and verified testimonies from former mercenaries and contractors who had facilitated the plundering. Every delegate received a copy. "I did not come here to speak," Traoré said. "I came here to return the voices that were stolen from our ancestors." The room erupted in emotion. Some wept. Others stood in stunned silence. A few walked out, but most stayed. Because this wasn't just about numbers or resources, it was about reclaiming identity. "For centuries," Traoré continued, "we have spoken to the world. And the world heard our music, took our minerals, admired our strength, but ignored our pain. Today, Africa speaks again. And this time, you will listen." His words were raw, not rehearsed. And precisely because of that, they struck deeper than any resolution or agreement could. By sunset, 18 African nations signed a joint declaration, the Gold Dignity Pact. It committed member states to national audits of mineral wealth, the establishment of a shared repository of export data, and penalties for any official or company colluding with foreign entities to hide profits. It wasn't perfect. It didn't undo the past. But it was the most coordinated African economic stance in modern history. Foreign observers tried to downplay it as symbolic. But within hours, markets in Europe and the US dipped again, and commodity firms began issuing risk assessments. The system was shaking. Outside the conference center, thousands of young Africans gathered, waving flags and singing a new anthem created just days earlier, "Our Gold, Our Future." Traoré stepped onto a balcony, lifted one fist, and nodded. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The movement had already outgrown him. What began with one man stopping trucks at a border became a continental roar heard around the world. And though many battles still lay ahead, one truth was now undeniable. Africa had awoken, not with vengeance, but with vision, clarity, and the unstoppable weight of justice on its side. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.